We had Dr. Titi here a couple months ago and talked about the colleges of the church, and this will be part 2 of that session. Looking back over the history of Zumbro, we've had pastors in this congregation trained at Luther Seminary starting at least in 1912. So we go back a long, long time that we've had that gift of pastors being trained and prepared at Luther Seminary. We also in the 1980s had a lay theology weekend here that I was always excited about. We would, I think in the month of February, would bring the faculty from the seminary here and do a packed weekend of study. It was a great experience both for us as a congregation, but also kept the seminary in touch with congregations. We have a member of our congregation currently on the board of directors for Luther Seminary, Dave Larson, and so we've had some continuing connection on that level as well. Recently, there was a bump in the road at Luther Seminary. Some of you are well aware of that. Some financial stresses that hit the seminary. The administration changed, and we brought in an interim president who has done a masterful job of guiding the seminary through some very difficult times. He's with us today. We also heard about, 2 weeks ago, that we have a new president that has been elected to the seminary, and perhaps we'll hear a bit about that today. We want to take the time today to hear about the seminaries, not just Luther Seminary, but all the seminaries of the church. What is the future? How do things look? We are excited, those of us who have a contact with Luther Seminary, that we, I think, are out of the woods, that things are looking much brighter, and thanks to Rick Foss's guidance and leadership, it's been a good couple of years. Rick, good to have you at Zumbro this morning. We look forward to your presentation. We've got a couple of handouts that you should have. If not, raise your hand and we'll get them to you. Rick.
Thank you, Dwayne. Now I'll see if I can get this back on. Sort of like putting your makeup on while you're on stage. It doesn't want to go that way. It wants to go this way. Don't want to go. Usually they bend. Well, let's see. How does that work? Okay, that's good.
They need a class in microphones at the center.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Thank you, Dwayne. I wasn't quite sure what would be the best way to do this. But when you referenced the 1912 and the history, I thought, let me start with a little history about seminaries and theological education in the church, and then cover some things, and then just let's have conversation. Let's whatever you want. It is true that we drove into a ditch a couple of years back. Turns out that we were spending on very good things, spending more than we had, combined with the economic, all the external things. What was most difficult I'm sort of an optimist, and I kind of like to say everything's fine, but it wasn't fine, and we were in trouble and heading down fast financially. The saving graces were that the board acted very quickly when it did figure it out. There's so much strength. It's sort of like a good athlete, a really good athlete, or a really good student. If something's wrong, you can compensate because you got so much. Luther could compensate with all his different programs and different pieces, so it wasn't as apparent right away, but when it was, they acted. We have in the last year and a half dropped our compensation, which means our staff and faculty, by about a third. That was not easy. We didn't ever have a shortage of good people. We had more good people than we could have. Part of that was in the recent years there had been kind of hiring on the basis of I would call it hope or aspiration, or, you know, and especially in the years when things sort of got troubled both economically and in the LCA, to be honest, in '09 and after. And then those never really came to fruition, and cumulative, you know what happens cumulatively, one way or the other. We will be fine this year. We will cash flow. We have kind of revamped everything. One of the beautiful luxuries of a crisis, and we don't use the word crisis much because it sort of gets the gut, but it was. And I learned something in the floods. You know something about floods. Up in Red River Valley, I was in my former life serving as a bishop. I learned you don't ever waste the crisis, you don't ever waste the suffering. And you look at everything and you try to build it back better than it was. The luxury we had is everybody agreed we had to look at everything. So we've been looking at everything. What we discovered was the mission is solid as a rock. The purposes and all of that are great. Our caliber of student, faculty, and staff is outstanding. The support of the church as a whole is amazing. And as we sorted out, tried to distinguish with what was external that we can't control and what's internal that we can control, things are looking pretty good. We do have a new president coming, Dr. Robin Steinke. She's an ELCA pastor. She grew up outside in Cortland, just outside New Ulm, Minnesota. Went to Augustana College, and then was a middle school band director in suburb of Atlanta, Georgia. And then she was a financial advisor with American Express there, and then they moved her up here to into some training, management training. Somebody said to her, well, that would be good preparation for being a seminary president. She said, I think actually being a middle school band director was a better, better preparation. I think she's right. And then she was overseeing a regional thing for American Express in Columbus, Ohio, and sensed the call again, and so went to Trinity Seminary there in Columbus. Served very briefly in a congregation in Virginia because she finally listened to those who said you ought to just go get your doctorate. So she went to Cambridge in England and did a PhD in ethics, and Bonhoeffer is one of her specialties. Came back and has been on the faculty at Gettysburg Seminary in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania for 14 years, and the academic dean for 11. I know her fairly well, and think very, very highly of her. I'm both excited and at peace with her coming. And as much as I was planning to retire last year, and was not planning to do this, and will retire then when she comes now, and as much as I'm looking forward to that, if I weren't comfortable with who was coming next, I wouldn't be looking forward to retirement, but I am. So that's where we are at the moment. Let me take you on a history. My uncle went to Luther Seminary in the early 30s. There was no tuition. He and the other young men right out of college lived in a dormitory, Bachman, a place that we're kind of renovating for the future. Lived in the boarding school. They had no tuition. They also were 2 years of college tuition was returned to them as a stipend. Al Ragnes, they found some typewritten notes of Al Ragnes in a seminary appeal back in the early 80s, and he talks about this. When he came to seminary in 1928, there was no tuition, and to his surprise, 2 years of his college tuition were returned to him. When my father went to Luther Seminary in the 40s, there was no tuition. They weren't returning college tuition to him anymore. But the entire cost was picked up by the church. ELC in that, thanks, then later ALC, because this was the seedbed for the future leaders. In that case, mostly completely all pastors. As the church moved out into other leaders. So the costs were by the church. In the 50s, when Al Rognes went back to be president, he said not much had changed other than they had built Gullickson, the library, and it cost $200 a year for tuition. But the church still picked up all the costs. So salaries, etc. If there was need for a building, the church had a fund drive or a capital campaign and paid for it because, as with some of the other predecessor Lutheran bodies and other seminaries, this was the church's vehicle for the new leaders for the next generation, and you certainly weren't going to eat your seed corn, you were going to tend that. By the late 60s, early 70s, when a couple of us in this room were at seminary, what was our tuition, $600? Something like that, I don't remember. Pretty modest. And into the even into the early 80s, it was not deemed that there should be any other real source of funding for seminaries other than the national church. Move forward, things shifted radically. In 1987, when the ELCA came together, the goal of the national church was that 50% of seminary education costs would be picked up by the national and synodical budgets. Never came close. Today, 7.5% at best of Luther Seminary's operating costs are picked up by church-wide and synod. So, in the meantime, what happens? My elevator speech on how you fund theological education or seminary education is this. Nobody but the body of Christ ever has, will, or should fund seminary education, should fund theological education. Who else should? Nobody. But I say body of Christ rather than the church, because we all have in our head what the church means, okay? It's the body of Christ embodied how? Well, is it the body of Christ, the national and regional expressions of it? Yes. It should be. It should be in the budgets. And the church-wide have been working very hard to try to, with challenging budgets, try to keep that up. It really does have to be. I mean, we are a seminary of the ELCA. The bylaws and the board makeup is determined by that. There needs to be some financial support. I think it ought to be a little higher, but it certainly can't go away. But yes, that's one way. Is it the body of Christ, the person who comes from the congregation, goes back to lead a congregation, and en route pays tuition? Well, yes. But at this point, about 20-some% of our income is through tuition. And of course, most of that is they borrow. So sometimes we think that it should be similar to a college. But think about this. It has no similarity. A college is fundamentally tuition-driven, right? At least the boards I've served on. 60 to 85%, probably in the 70s is typical, tuition-driven. So if you need more revenue, you get more students. Now, who pays that tuition? Is it the student themselves? Very seldom. It's the families. Well, or they borrow. And that's becoming now a real problem. The last decade, probably 6-8 years, the biggest shift we've seen in the financial problems of our students is the debt they come in with from college. It didn't used to be a big one. But the student themselves, but it's tuition driven. Seminaries have never been tuition driven. You heard what I said earlier, there was no tuition. But I think there should be some skin in the game for the student. So I think, yes, the person who pays tuition, but that is not our primary and never will be our primary revenue stream. They ought to pay some, and helped maybe by the congregation or their family or whatever, but these are adults, you know, your family isn't going to pay so much, as much for a 26-year-old or a, you know, whatever. Is it the, so that's two ways. Is it the body of Christ, the person in the pew, who we smile and call a donor? Absolutely. I don't know that we have any donors that aren't a person in the pew. This is actually where the greatest capacity of the body of Christ is. And probably you care as much as anybody about the quality of the pastors that are going to be coming into the future, right? So, like a lot of other things that are funded through the church, it isn't all through the unified budget. There are a lot of things that we individually, at least I do, support because they matter directly to me. So yes, and that's actually probably the largest of the, I'm going to give you 5 streams. 5 streams right now. And the support from the people in the pew, you, the donors, is remarkable. But some people say, well, the seminary would be in trouble if they weren't rescued by the donors. I say, wait a minute. The donors are not them, the donors are us. This is the body of Christ. We're in this thing together. They care about what we're doing. Is it the body of Christ, the congregation, as congregation budget? Well, in the ELCA polity, seminaries didn't really have the permission or to go out and go straight to congregations so much. It's sort of, but really not. And congregation budgets are stretched. We have a number of congregations who have said, we really want the seminary on our budget. And that's great, or it might be a foundation or something, and we want that as, it's great. And so that's a part of it, but it will never be the major part of it. Congregations are always have, if you're worth anything, you can imagine more good ministry to do than you can fund, right? But that's 4th. The 5th is yield, the way that the body of Christ is embodied to fund it, is off yield of assets. And that could be an endowment. And Luther has a healthy endowment. They've been working at it for a long time, and it needs to grow. And that's one way. Or off auxiliary enterprises, which both seminaries, educational schools, churches tend to be terrible at. We're not really great landlords or business people by and large, so we don't tend to make a whole lot of money. In fact, that's one of the things we've been doing this year. And I'll get to that in a minute on property. So at least those 5 ways, the body of Christ is embodied, and it's sort of like a portfolio. Some of you look old enough to have thought about a retirement portfolio. You rebalance it sometimes, right? Depending on what's possible and what the needs are. So we may have to intentionally kind of look at where do those revenue streams come from. In the meantime, I looked around. Luther Seminary sits on 47.5 acres, which is 4 times as much acreage as Augsburg College. And we have buildings. And we have some good buildings. On the other hand, for the last 20 or 30 years, when we've said we balanced the budget, depreciation was never figured in. It was just meant we didn't spend any more cash than we had coming in. And so we have deferred depreciation. Amazing. Do any of you know where the term white elephant comes from? It's one of my favorite things. You know, the white elephant kind of thing. Well, in some, I forget, it was like way early in a place like Siam or Thailand, way back when the main ruler was mad at one of the princes, he would give him a white elephant as a gift. Because white elephants were sacred, you could not use them to work, but you had to feed them. So I looked around and said, you know, I think we have some white elephants here. And we talk about these as assets, but the way in which, you know, they're tended or not tended, it probably costs us more than they come in. So we're looking at all the property. We're in the later stages of actually selling to a local person who, two of our apartments for a lot of our married students out of, only 25% of Luther students live on campus now. 25%. I'll circle around to why in a minute. But, so we, but if that comes through, which it should in probably August, we'll get a significant amount of cash. We can repay the endowment that we inappropriately borrowed from, legally, but inappropriately. We can get rid of a couple million in deferred depreciation. They can put the things in better place for our students, better shape for our students, and they see our students as, of course, primary renters along with others. I think it's the right thing to do. We've looked at other possibilities of building other sorts of things with other partners, and they may come to fruition, but at the moment what we're doing is selling those too, and putting an elevator in Gullickson, which is paid for, and the accreditation people a decade ago said if you don't do it by the next time we come around, we aren't going to credit you, so we're going to beat that deadline. And then we're kind of trying to revamp and refit Bachman for a number of things, which is the old iconic red brick building, which is on the front of this. Here's some of the issues in the future. The world is not static. The world spins. And the needs and the perceived needs of the world and our communities and the church get more and more complicated. We're a global, sort of a global society in one sense, but we all live in some place or other. Ministry gets more and more complex, and it's not simpler to be a pastor these days. It's more difficult than it used to be. So how do we equip our new leaders? We've been working already when this distraction came along, this problem, on new curriculum. About every 20 years you do a new curriculum, and we were. And it'll launch this fall. Faculty's been superb. They've been amazing. They've pulled together in ways that under this sort of stress, I didn't believe they could. The new curriculum, you'll see sort of an outline of it here. It has much more flexibility in terms of electives. The way in which our curriculum has sort of lived into over the last 20 years takes 30 courses. In some places count them as 3 credits a course, so 90, but we count them as just a course, one full course, 30 full courses for a Master of Divinity. For an MA, it's usually 20 or 16. So to do a Master of Divinity, which a pastor would do, 30 courses, 10 a year is sort of full load. So 3 years plus the year of internship, 4 years. So the old traditional pattern, when you come to Luther Seminary, you move, give up your job or whatever, you come, you live for 2 years at Luther Seminary, then you go out and be an intern someplace, then you come back for 1 year at Luther Seminary, and then you go out and serve in a congregation. A few people do that at this point, but you already know that not everybody does that. I mean, we have over 100 students right now in our Master of Divinity Distributive Learning program. Lisa Kipp was in that. We have them, one from Turkey and one from Norway, but mostly all over the U.S. And in this program, it's been going about 6 or 8 years now. We've had 2 graduating groups of them, cohorts. They come in as a cohort between 17 and 29. 29 came in this fall. It's our biggest cohort, or they usually start in January. They study together. 2/3 of their courses they can take online. The accrediting people have loosened up in that in the last few years. And 1/3 they take on campus in intensive courses. They come in for a couple of weeks in January and a couple of weeks in June for 5 years. We were worried that they wouldn't develop community. Whoa, were we wrong. they have more attachment both to Luther Seminary and to each other, and they have a community that you can't believe. Of course, geography isn't the barrier it used to be, because they are connected all the time. They study together, whether they live in the same place or not. And professors have discovered, irony of ironies, as one said to me, a retired professor who started teaching this reluctantly, said, I discovered they can hide in my classroom. I don't know what they're doing behind their computer screen, but they can't hide online. They have to post. So everybody can see what they're, I mean, you can't hide. So there's actually, we have now taken, as we're redoing the new curriculums for MDiv and MA, we've taken the learnings from the distributed learning piece and I'm putting them in the cohort pieces, it's peer learning basically, into all of their things. It's marvelous. But we have residential on campus, we have commuters, and we have the distributive learning. And it's a significant 3 groups. We have a whole number of degree programs for youth ministries and teaching and people going into academics. These sort of grew like Topsy, all sorts of things. You know, if things are going well and you start something and we get a grant and you start something, then you just kind of let it go. And what happens after a while? All these things kind of grow in silos. And then one of the things that caught us financially was you get a great grant for something and you get going and then you just move it into the budget. You know, and after a while we could make that work for a long time. And these were good things. Money wasn't spent on bad things. It was good things. We're doing a whole lot of integrating of things. Our PhD program, the way it kind of evolved, 6 years ago it shifted some. There's no tuition. You give stipends and you help people come from all over and help them. It was all expense and no revenue. We had 61. We expanded the numbers. We just couldn't sustain it. It's on hold. We're going to begin this late spring and summer looking to see if there is a model we can put together. It would be really good if we could have a modest but high-quality PhD program. We have the Doctor of Ministry or the DMins, we have Master of Theology, MTH, we have different degree programs, we've got all sorts of MAs, but it would be nice if we could do that, but we have to be somewhat realistic about whether that can work. In all this, how do you connect to other seminaries? Well, I'll be going next Wednesday to meet with the other 7 ELCA seminary presidents for 4 days. We've been trying to figure out what you do together. Luther is by far the largest, financially the strongest. Even at our worst, every other one of them would have traded places, which gives you a little sense of the difficulty. Here's what worries me most. I don't worry much about whether the body of Christ will respond to open, honest, missional need. We always have. But sometimes we get things, any of you ever have anything to do with the stock market or read anything about that? Okay. You know the temptation to buy high because you get all excited because it's gone up and sell low because you get scared because it's gone down? And how statistically then, the market has done this, people's, the whole aggregate of us humans have done worse than the market because we've bought high and sold low out of fear and excitement, okay? So there's something like that variability going on in the churches and in the leadership of the churches over the last decade. Let me see if I can parse it out, because I think this is the most significant issue. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, well, let me go back. In the mid-90s, there was pretty much a about the number of pastors coming out, that there were jobs and need calls available. And it was, you know, a few too many in the cities and a few too few in the country, but by and large it was there. and you know, people would retire and people would come through and there would be a replacement. Then for a while, churches were struggling a little. We started, the ELCA started to sort of slide a little in the late 90s and hundreds, so it was getting a little hard for pastors, and at the same time, pastors were starting to come out with debt. So what was the narrative? The narrative was, well, why would you go to seminary? You just come out with a big debt and nobody's going to call you anyway because there isn't a place for you. And what really triggered that into high gear was in '09 when the economics went down. Before that, about 350 pastors in the ELCA retired every year. And it went from 350 to 212 one year. Why? Well, people saw their retirement accounts nosedive and said, I can't retire. Plus, we're healthier longer, and so suddenly, and that the retirement numbers stayed low. At the same time, the cohort, the number of pastors in the ELCA by age, the largest cohorts are about my age and down a decade. So this late 50s to late 60s now. So there will be, because if we don't retire, we'll die. One way or another, we're not going to be there. Yeah, we'll die anyway. Okay, but we won't be there. But this compressed. There was non-retirements. At the same time, congregations felt the financial scrunch. And if you're feeling financially pressed and you're hunkering down, do you open up new ministries? You kind of, if somebody moves, well, let's not see if, maybe we won't replace that one just now. We'll see if we can cover. So at the same time that people weren't retiring, churches weren't calling. So for about 5 years, from I'd say 08 to 13, it was really tough for new grads to find appropriate calls, and they're coming out with debt and they got to do something about it. So that buzz got out there. That's yesterday's narrative. Starting a year ago, or about 9 months ago, bishops now, when they go to the assignment process, instead of having too many people, they're only getting about half of what they need. Because congregations are beginning to come out from under the bunkers, and our numbers of seminarians have gone down. Why? Because they said, well, why would you go there? There's no job and you're going to get a big debt. They're not stupid. So they didn't go. So our narrative, what I'm afraid of, is that yesterday's narrative will continue in the buzz. And that the church that needs a whole lot of new, young, entrepreneurial, creative, imaginative pastors and other leaders won't have them. That's my fear. So what can you do? And people in other congregations, we need you to pray for Luther and for all the seminaries and for the church. We need you to be supportive financially in the ways you can. We really need you to say to young people, or medium young people, who would be good church leaders, I don't know if God's calling you, but if God calls you to serve, I'd be delighted, you'd be great. If that message would get out, it has to be an internal call, but usually it has to be externally also encouraged. If that message could get out over and over and over again, and you can smile and say, and I'm sure we'll try to help. Yeah. But please think about it. Now they can come from all over. So in our distributive learning, the synod that has sent the most of students to Luther in that DL, the distributive learning, is Central States, Kansas, Missouri. The second most is Florida, Bahamas. The third most is Southeast, that's Atlanta, in that area. I mean, we got them from all over the place. Why? They don't have to disrupt totally their revenue streams or their family life or whatever. They're about a decade older than the average, so they're in the early 40s average age instead of early 30s. Great, another 20, 30 years of service of some phenomenal people. It's doable. They need encouragement. They're actually coming out without the same kind of debt because we didn't have to move 3 times and disrupt. It's more complicated from the seminary. We need students not to be financially afloat because we're not really tuition driven. We need students to fulfill the mission of the church and get our next generation of leaders. That's what we need. The new curriculum is much more, what you can call it, the jargon is outcome-based rather than seat hours-based. You know, the way you used to judge whether somebody knew something is how many hours they sat in the classroom. Now we got a whole different way of doing it. So they got portfolios. You have to demonstrate you actually know something. We also are taking very seriously that people come in with very different experiences and understanding. If you're a religion major out of Gustavus or St. Olaf, you may not need the same thing as somebody who has just recently come into the church. If you're a, or Augsburg, if you're a, if you are, you come out of a business financial world, you may not need the same sort of things as somebody who comes out of the music world or something. So in our previous, out of the 30, and then on top of that we had to add Greek because we didn't give credit for it, and we had an internship and clinical pastoral education, CPE. Those are all good things. They're all folded into the 30 now. Plus, instead of, you could only have, out of those 30 some, only 4.5 were electives. Now about 11 for most will be electives. So we've pretty much quadrupled, tripled to quadrupled the percentage of electives, acknowledging that if you're going to be accountable for what you're learning, we want to help you be able to learn what you actually need to learn. Now there are core courses in what you would guess, Bible and theology and history. But we've got all this breadth. It should be superb. It should be superb. And that launches this fall. If you look at the quick facts, this is just, it's probably about 4 months out of date now. Enrollment, 696 students. Well, some of them are part-time, some of them are very part-time, some of them are full-time, some of them are, I mean, you know that counting can be, even if it's very honest, can be misleading, right? So the full-time equivalencies of are in the high 400s to 500 that we report into the accreditation. But then, of course, what does that mean? If 60 to 90 of them are an internship, what does that mean for how many courses we need to teach? Or if, I mean, you get all these different things. So our interim academic dean, Craig Kester, have any of you interacted with him? He's a New Testament professor, grew up in Denison, outside of Northfield, yeah. He's our academic dean, just a godsend, interim. And he went through and said, here are the students, we went through and figured out exactly how much we needed in terms, and so we're trying to have a faculty that is fewer than it was, but how do you cover the breadth of all that? It's you'll look at the different degree programs. The Master of Divinity, that's to be a pastor. MA includes, you know, their youth people, social, I mean, all sorts of kinds of ministry. PhD and Master of Theology, that's the second theological degree, as is Doctor of Ministry. Certificates. We hope to shift this. One of the things I believe, and have been sort of pushing, although I've been very clear that I shouldn't design anything for the future because I won't be there to tend it, is that the seminary needs to be more connected to our churches and our leaders throughout the career. That is, we need and are expanding what we can do for courses, whether it's for degrees or credits or not, for everybody. You talked about the lay school that came down here. We're looking at all those different models. And online, I don't know if any of you have checked Working Preacher or Enter the Bible or some of the things we have on our website online. Amazing capacity to connect and serve the church. So we need to serve the church in equipping and preparing new leaders and keeping them prepared throughout their life in ways that are very complex but lovely. Our female-male has been hanging around 50-50 for quite a while. Denomination, we have all sorts of different ones, but you'll see. I mean, we are at ELCA Seminary. The ELCA is very self-conscious about being a bridge to all sorts of other bodies. If the ELCA self-identifies as ecumenically a bridge, how could we possibly be an ELCA seminary and be cocooned? So we are also serving and working at that. International, you'll see some of the different pieces. It has gone very well this last year and a half or so for a couple of minor reasons and major reasons. The minor reasons are that, they're not minor, I guess. When it became apparent we had a problem, the board and others didn't shy away and responded. And when it became apparent that these things were real, even those of us who would rather not think about them, or faculty that would just say, you know, let me teach, or staff, let me do my job, or somebody else should fix it. Nobody went there. People pulled together. I mean, it was messy, but people pulled together. These are good people. Nobody does this sort of thing by themselves, or any small group by themselves. The body is healing itself in a way. In the midst of it, the first thing we did is said, have we got our mission straight? Do we have our mission right? And it came back, yes, we do. And it's a mission that really was shaped 20 years ago in when it said, seminary cannot be an inward-looking institution on a hill. It has to be outward-looking, connected to the church and the world, and understanding its service as helping equip leaders of all sorts to meet the needs of the gospel and in the world. Mission is solid. We've been painfully open about everything. I just said, you know, we just have to say whatever is to whomever asks. And people have responded extraordinarily well. I think Luther, and I hope some of the other seminaries, will have very significant and good years in the years ahead. But remember Pogo's line, we have met the enemy and they are us. We have met the seminary and you are us. I just would plead with anybody, you got to use we, not they. We're in this thing together, and we have work to do. God's calling us to try to do this, but we need to do it with one another. And one of the earliest things I said, to the extent we do this with one another rather than to one another, especially as we were having to cut positions, we'll be okay. And people have been more than gracious. So, what do you want to know? Go.
Do we have microphones that work now?
Is this working?
Yeah.
What's a signature course as opposed to a core course or an elective?
Signature course, core course, and elective. The signature course is a course that's will probably, there are very few, probably team taught. Team teaching was one of the last curriculum signature things because you get this wonderful playoff. You get, Fredheim and Sponheim teaching together or whatever. Well, it costs twice as much. But they're together. Every MDiv and MA will take those signature courses. Then there are some core courses for the MDiv that the MA may not take, and that everybody will take. So in the fields, the Bible and a couple others, huge conversation over months and months about, I can't tell the difference. What do you mean this is this and this is this? So it's a great question. But the signature courses, everybody who takes an MA or MDiv at Luther Seminary, this should be signature for Luther Seminary. It's mostly team taught. It's a little across fields. The cores are the core things in these things, in these areas, Bible or history or whatever. And then elective, we have a whole lot of different electives, and there was a great debate about, well, if you give that many electives, how do you know if everybody won't just take everything that they like and nothing they don't like? And we said, well, we do have faculty advisors, and we do have candidacy committees, and we do have this whole accountability outcome thing. I don't think we're going to let anybody get away with that, nor do I think they'll want to. So, great question, modest answer. We're living it out.
Microphone here for David.
I don't know if I need the mic, but first of all, thank you for coming down to Zumbro. You've glossed over a few things. We basically ruined the bishop's, President Foss's life about 1.5 years ago when he had plans to golf, go to the lake, visit with grandchildren, do a lot of things, except that we had this problem at the seminary. And I think the issue then, and without getting into details, the seminary really needed a person of credibility and integrity, and also someone who was sort of an insider. He'd been there a couple of years after he finishing his reign as bishop in eastern North Dakota, but also was an outsider because things had to change. And I think with that credibility and integrity, when you talk about losing 1/3 of your staff and 1/3 of your faculty, you can imagine the internal discussions that went on and the conversation, and someone had to moderate that and lead that. And I don't think we could have been served any better than Bishop Foss in doing that, and so I think all of us are grateful for that. That's the comment. My question to you is, I think you've been a proponent for the relationship to the church, to the churches like Zumbro. And I think this curriculum is really an opportunity to strengthen that relationship. And wondering if you could be a little bit more specific, and one of the questions I have is the internship. Some internships are great. The aspiring pastors get a lot out of it, and some I think are reasonably worthless in terms of what happens. And as I understand it, but I'd like you to maybe talk more about that, how can that be strengthened so there's more accountability for the students, and how can churches like Zumbro play an even more active role in that curriculum and in the development of church leaders?
Good question. We've been working, even before the new curriculum, to try to make sure that the internships was not just seat hours, another version of, they spent their year. I remember somebody said to me, well, it doesn't matter where they go, it's only a year. I said, what? Makes no sense. I mean, if some need expanded horizons, some need focus, because all they've had is expanded horizons. Some need a really seasoned supervisor. Some should be out trying, what you're doing is trying to inhabit the skin of a pastor and see if you can inhabit it and flourish. So we've been, over these past few years, really working at tightening up that, and it turns out, since you can now stay connected to people in a way that you couldn't 20 years ago, other than go visit them, we're getting much better at that. So let's take the distributed learning, the internships. What you do is you work with the synod and the bishop in the place where they are to find a really fine internship site near where they're serving, but not in the congregation they're in. And the way we can do that is, it costs about $30,000 for a full-blown internship. You got a stipend, you got housing, you got things, goes up to $30,000. But if you're restricted, either in the Twin Cities or or wherever you are DL, you're restricted, the assumption is you have a house, and there needs to be some kind of, so the church doesn't have to provide housing. So it's down to up to 20. And we have a fair number, about half of our DL internships do what we call concurrent. So over a 2-year span, they're half intern and also taking courses. Now you're less than 10 for a congregation per year. So I would say, we can't go out trampling around the country trying to steal internship sites from other sister seminaries. Plus, we wouldn't know which ones are good. So can you tell me, are there some really fine pastors and congregations that you would love to have the experience being a supervisor and connected to a seminary that might be a good place that they could afford at this rate? And so we're getting new supervisors in congregations. Now, sometimes they serve for one and then out, but they still have had that experience. So in all sorts of ways, and now Chris Sharon, who is one of our professors who's now into doing contextual learning, is working really hard on this sort of accountable, outcome-connected piece. Complicated, of course, but the great majority are, we have very, very few of those sort of occupy the year and get it out of the way times now. It's really been, I don't know, our continued learner, our continuing education, our Kairos program and others, Sally Peters is sort of the coordinator of that. That's always been sort of over here. Here are the degree programs and that's over here. My understanding of it, and I hope it goes this way, is this is all under an umbrella now. That is, we want to stay connected, get connected, and stay connected to congregations and leaders and in different ways. We don't know exactly what that means. We're not into the MOOCs at this point, the massive online things. We might actually take, one of our charismatic profs and say, anybody wants to sign up for $50, go ahead, just sit in your bedroom with your bunny slippers and do it. But that's not how we see online education typically. That's one of the next chapters, is how to do that. I know that we need to. How to build on that. Yes?
Here we got a question.
Okay, you have just stated that Luther Seminary, it was financially in bad straits. But at the point where you are now, the other 6 seminaries are looking at you and saying, hey, Luther's the top. Has there ever been any consideration of seminaries combining curriculum or combining how you do things so that there'd be less expense both places?
There have been all sorts of conversations since 1987, whether we need that many seminaries. The question is sort of like combining cemeteries. What? I'm not going to move, Grandma. So each of the 8 has buildings and history and heritage and, I'm serious about that. In my former life, you try to, but too, Southern is now a part of Lenore College, because independent, and PLTS, Pacific Lutheran, is part of California Lutheran. So they're really not independent seminaries, but they are the seminary of the college. Gettysburg and Philadelphia are in exceedingly serious, they've talked for 150 years. Other than being in Pennsylvania, they have very little in common, but they are both in Pennsylvania. And now they're exploring 2 seminaries with 1 faculty and 1 administration possibility. We've had conversations. We actually have an agreement with Gettysburg that we've been exchanging professors. We would love to do more, but it really gets back to combine in any way that really impacts the cost significantly somebody's got to give up buildings and space, which is like moving cemeteries. So,
Thank you.
it's tough, yeah.
Looking at Les Hornfett, I guess, we probably had between us 35, 40 years in ministry. If we're bringing graduates that are coming out of colleges, maybe they're in their 40s, we're talking about maybe 20 years. That's going to be an added cost to the seminary to keep carrying the same number of pastors who are serving for a shorter length of time. Does that look like that's going to happen?
Well, if you really want to look at demographics, this isn't terribly politically correct. But we now have, when I went there were 3 women, whether Dawn and
There
Barb
was
and
one, I think, when
one
we started.
when we
And then
started.
One graduated the year before we started.
Right.
And then there were,
Okay,
yeah.
right. Now, not only when you're going at 40, if 1 equals 35 years of service, 1 doesn't quite equal 1. Women will statistically take more time out of a career for family than men will. We have, with some regularity, 2 superb candidates come in, and they come out as one married clergy couple. They have a tendency to be about 1.5 pastors. None of this is bad. They're all really good. But in terms of how much service over a lifetime, it's different. Has been for a while. I don't know that that's a problem. We can handle, with our faculty and our staff, we can handle more students than we've got. Every seminary that in place can. And we can handle them well. And then, the other piece is that, you know, it was always a myth that you'd be a solo pastor. I mean, if there were people there in the congregation, you weren't solo, and if there weren't people, there wasn't much point. And even the Lone Ranger had Tonto and Silver. So, you know, there's, but we had this myth of the pastor being the solo thing. We really are trying to equip people to be leaders in community, servant leaders in community. I mean, if, it isn't I lead and you follow. It's, I mean, the truth is, if it hadn't been for really strong leadership from a whole bunch of people, we would not be where we are today. Now, where we are today still doesn't have everything fixed, but we were bleeding about $3 to $4 million cash for the last 4 or 5 years in a $20-some million budget. That's not a pretty cumulative piece. We will not be in the red with cash this year. We might even actually, we'll find out June 30th. The year starts July 1 to June 30th. It looks like we might even get to a place where we could fold in a reasonable depreciation and cash flow. That would be better than we've been for the last 15 years. That's because of the responses of people, and we're paying an awful lot of close attention to things. But the finances aren't the point. You know this. Money isn't the point. But we had for years pastors, you know, when I went there it was sort of unspoken, you pick God or mammon. Well, I picked God. I went to seminary, so I wasn't supposed to have to worry about money. But if you can't handle the money, the mission gets debilitated. And so then we have the nice catchphrases. Well, money follows mission. Yes, it does. But if you're irresponsible with it or inept with it, it won't follow it very long. You know, so last year in the toughest, last spring was tough. March 19th was when we had to tell a number of, I mean, we didn't fire faculty. That was more complicated. But we had to tell a number of people that they did not have jobs anymore, people who did not want to retire or move. I mean, we could negotiate everything we could negotiate. And we had to do that. Our students who are going out probably were more keenly aware of why it mattered that they could at least, if they weren't the financial guru in the congregation, and I kept saying, you don't have to be the expert. You have people in the pews who are expert. You have to know enough to tell the difference and to let them know you care about what they're good at, and then invite them in and let them be good. But you gotta be able to know enough about this. Our students were much more attuned to that last year than any previous years. So they'll probably come out. I mean, we have, one of the things we're doing is now we have 60 or 70 students are offered an individual financial coach, volunteer. You know, a layperson who's good at this, and come in, whether it's their personal finances or how you do stewardship. We got a stewardship center. I mean, we're working at that. But the money isn't the point. We need really fine, committed, gifted, faithful leaders who care about Jesus Christ and will share that with the world. And we need more of them in the church, not just Luther, than we currently have. And it isn't to balance the budget. It's to serve the needs of the church and the world. That's the message.
Rick, thanks for the years you've given the church as pastor, as bishop of the seminary. And you've committed to the goal